Ella Miller, 8, clutches her small grocery bag. The peaceful rhythm of her footsteps alongside Duke, her limping German shepherd, shattered abruptly when a figure slipped silently from the darkened alley ahead. Before Ella could react, a gaunt man emerged into the faint glow of a street lamp, his cold eyes glinting with menace. This was Victor Slade, a prison escapee with an angular face, scraggly beard, and a faint scar running down his temple, a relic of his years clashing with the law. Spotting Ella, a sinister smirk flickered across his lips. A chilling knot of fear tightened in Ella's chest, freezing her in place. "Out here all alone, kid?" Slade called out, his raspy voice laced with a dangerous thrill as he stepped closer. He was no stranger to Willow Creek, a criminal once locked away by Ella's father, John Miller, for drug trafficking and violence. But this time, he wasn't just running, he was hunting revenge. What Slade didn't know was that as Duke lowered his head, hackles rising and teeth bared, this wasn't merely a family pet's protective instinct. When Slade reached toward Ella, Duke's eyes locked on to him with the honed precision of years of professional canine training. What happened next would change Willow Creek forever. Drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us the city you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. Ella Miller, at 8 years old, wasn't like the other kids in Willow Creek. Born with mild autism spectrum disorder, she experienced the world differently, sometimes overwhelmed by sounds and sensations others barely noticed, yet remarkably attuned to subtleties most overlooked. Her honey blonde hair, often gathered into two uneven braids she insisted on tying herself, framed a face with deep blue eyes that could fixate with unusual intensity on anything that captured her interest. Ella spoke less than her peers, but when she did, her words carried the weight of careful thought. Despite the social challenges she faced, Ella had an extraordinary gift for connection, not with crowds, but in the profound, loyal bonds she forged with those she trusted. And no bond was stronger than the one she shared with Duke, the German shepherd who'd become her shadow, her protector, and her closest friend. Duke's story began far from the Miller home, in a remote canine training center where he'd proven himself one of the most promising police dogs the team had ever seen. With a sturdy 92-pound frame cloaked in glossy black and gray fur, Duke was paired with Officer Thomas Calder by a veteran trainer known for her exacting standards. Together, they became legends in the force, excelling in narcotics detection and taking down dangerous suspects. But everything crumbled 3 years ago during a raid in an abandoned dockside. As criminals ambushed with guns and knives, Officer Calder shouted for Duke to fall back, only to take a fatal stab wound himself. Defying orders, Duke lunged to shield Calder, sustaining a deep gash in his hind leg while trying to drag his handler to safety. Though backup arrived in time, Calder didn't survive. Duke refused to leave his fallen partner's side, snarling at anyone who approached until he was forcibly pulled away. The physical wounds healed, but Duke was never the same. Psychological scars surfaced as erratic behavior, rendering him unfit for further service. Slated for euthanasia despite his heroic record, Duke found an unexpected champion in a quiet little girl who somehow understood his pain. Willow Creek had once epitomized the ideal American small town, a place where doors stayed unlocked and kids played freely until the streetlights flickered on. Nestled between rolling hills and split by the gentle creek that gave it its name, it boasted quaint storefronts, a historic courthouse with a gleaming white clock tower, and neighborhoods of well-kept homes with sprawling yards. But in recent years, economic hardship had crept in as the lumber mill and factory downsized, leaving many jobless. The drug crisis ravaging rural America hadn't spared Willow Creek, bringing a surge in theft and trafficking. Most troubling was Victor Slade, a fugitive who'd once been jailed by local officer John Miller. After escaping prison, Slade had lurked in the town's outskirts, quietly sowing fear with a vendetta against the Miller family and anyone who stood in his way. Despite the efforts of the understaffed Willow Creek Police Department, the town's sense of safety had eroded. Officer John Miller removed his police cap, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair as he settled behind his desk at the station. Before him loomed a growing stack of case files, each one a story of lives slipping into darkness, no matter how hard he tried. His community outreach program, aimed at steering vulnerable teens away from drugs and crime, had sparked some hope. But the shadow of Victor Slade, a fugitive fueled by burning resentment, seemed to outpace his every effort. John had launched the initiative after watching too many bright kids succumb to addiction, their potential buried under the weight of poverty and the fleeting escape of drugs. This morning he'd met with Ethan Carter, a decorated Marine who'd returned from Iraq with a Bronze Star, haunting PTSD nightmares and little support. The man had spiraled into painkiller abuse, then methamphetamine, his soldier's discipline overtaken by addiction's relentless demands. John had found him holed up in a battered truck near the abandoned lumber mill and convinced him to join the department's reintegration program instead of facing possession charges. "You served your country," John had told him, his voice steady but firm. "Now let us help you reclaim yourself." This approach, seeing the person behind the crime, defined John's policing philosophy, sometimes putting him at odds with colleagues who favored harsher tactics. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Sarah. "Don't forget Ella's therapy at 3:30. He smiled faintly, thinking of his daughter. Her challenges were steep, but her spirit was unbreakable. The smile faded as he recalled his heated debate with Sarah about Duke. She'd initially opposed keeping the troubled K9, fearing an animal with a volatile past posed a risk to their special needs child. "He's too damaged," she'd insisted, her voice thick with worry. "We can't take that chance with Ella." But John had seen something in Duke's eyes when Ella first approached him, a silent recognition between two wounded souls. The memory of Ella's first meeting with Duke remained etched in John's mind with crystal clarity. The K9 facility had scheduled the German Shepherd for euthanasia after he repeatedly failed post-trauma evaluations. John had only brought Ella along that day because his shift was canceled, never intending for her to interact with the unstable dog. But while he discussed paperwork with the facility manager, Ella wandered down the kennel row, stopping before Duke's cage. The dog, who'd growled at seasoned handlers, lay still, his sharp eyes fixed on the little girl who showed no fear or hesitation. "He's sad because his friend is gone," she said, her voice unusually direct, pointing at Duke. "He thinks he failed him." The staff exchanged startled glances. No one had told Ella about Officer Calder. When John asked how she knew, she just tilted her head, as if the answer was obvious. "I can see it in his eyes," she said softly. "He wants to be with us." What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Duke, deemed too erratic for service or adoption, began to transform in Ella's presence. His recovery accelerated once the Millers started regular visits. The trainers couldn't explain it. The dog, who'd been tense and unapproachable with experts, turned gentle and steady with the quiet child. After 4 months of trials and rigorous tests, Duke was officially retired from police service and joined the Miller household, where his bond with Ella deepened into something extraordinary. Sarah remained wary until the afternoon of Ella's worst sensory meltdown, when the overwhelmed girl hid in a narrow stairwell corner beyond her parents' reach. Somehow Duke understood. He lay patiently outside, breathing steadily until Ella crept out, her small hands gripping his fur as her breath synced with his. From that moment, Sarah never questioned Duke's place in their family again. Now, nearly 2 years later, Duke rarely left Ella's side. He accompanied her to school as part of her special accommodations, waiting patiently outside during therapy sessions. The dog, once labeled uncontrollable, had become Ella's anchor in chaotic moments, a living shield between her sensitive soul and a world often too loud, too bright, too unpredictable. That afternoon, as the sky began to darken, Sarah realized they'd run out of Ella's favorite toast bread, one of the few foods she'd reliably eat for breakfast. A potential crisis loomed. Ella's rigid routines were her lifeline for coping. A small disruption, like a missing meal, could unravel the day for everyone. The corner store was just 2 blocks away in their usually quiet neighborhood, and with Duke by her side, John agreed to let Ella make the short trip alone. "You sure?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing with concern. "She's only 8, John." "She needs to build independence," he replied firmly. "We can't shield her forever. The store is practically in sight from our kitchen window, and Duke won't leave her." After some back and forth, they compromised. John handed Ella the emergency whistle he'd prepared months earlier, a precaution born of his cop instincts amid the town's growing unrest. with strict instructions to come straight home. He watched from the stoop as his daughter and the German Shepherd set off down Oak Street, Ella's small hand resting lightly on Duke's shoulder, the early light catching the golden strands in her light brown hair. Now, seated at his desk, staring at files he wasn't really reading, John felt an inexplicable unease tighten his chest. He checked his watch. Ella should have been home 20 minutes ago. Sarah would have called if anything was wrong. He told himself he was overreacting, a hazard of police work, but the dread wouldn't lift. Maybe he'd drive her route, just to be sure. Suddenly, Sarah's voice rang out. "John!" Her voice trembled despite her effort to stay calm, the panic seeping through. "Ella's not back yet." At that moment, Ella sensed the heavy footsteps before she heard the low voice echo from the nearby alley. The sudden intrusion of an unfamiliar presence sent a jolt of discomfort through her. She froze, her small hand instinctively clutching Duke's fur as the German Shepherd tensed beside her. Strangers meant disruption, uncertainty, potential threats, all risks to the fragile balance she fought to maintain. Duke felt her breathing quicken and pressed himself against her leg, his weight a grounding anchor for her sensory overload. But this time, there was something more in Duke's stance, a razor-sharp alertness beyond his usual protectiveness. His ears swiveled toward the sound with the focus forged through years of rigorous training. His body coiled, ready to act like a machine long programmed for duty. Victor Slade stepped from the alley's shadows with slow, deliberate menace. In seconds, Ella found herself facing a towering man, his angular face shadowed by stubble, his cold eyes locked on her. His presence made her heart pound. She clutched her grocery bag to her chest like a shield, her eyes widening as she noticed the faded tattoo on his arm peeking from his tattered jacket. A mark her father had warned her about in tales of dangerous men to avoid. "Hello, little Miller girl," Slade said, his raspy voice tinged with dark amusement, closing the distance with controlled confidence. "Out alone today? Not very smart." Duke reacted instantly, positioning himself between Ella and the advancing man. A deep growl rumbled from his chest, not a pet's warning, but the controlled threat of a professionally trained canine. His stance shifted subtly into a combat-ready posture, honed for facing armed threats, his muscles primed to strike. Victor Slade faltered for a split second, a flicker of unease crossing his eyes as he sensed something in the dog's bearing that gave him pause. "Call off your mutt, kid," he said, the fake friendliness vanishing, replaced by a sharp edge. "I just want a quick word." Ella stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden confrontation. The world around her blurred as her senses struggled with the heavy footsteps, the stranger's gravelly voice, and the musty smell of his worn jacket. But through the fog of sensory overload, one truth cut through. This man meant harm. Her father's lessons about danger snapped into focus. "Duke, protect," she whispered, using the command she'd overheard John practicing with the dog near their home. Duke's response was immediate. His entire demeanor shifted, transforming from companion to a weapon primed for action. Victor Slade might have expected a pet, perhaps an intimidating one. What he now faced was something else entirely, an elite K-9 officer slipping back into the combat mindset that once made him the force's sharpest tool. As Slade took another step toward Ella, Duke's warning growl escalated into a perfectly controlled display of power, halting the man mid-stride. Slade's eyes narrowed with slow realization. "This ain't no regular dog," he said, his voice dropping, his hand creeping toward his waist where a concealed dagger rested. "This is a cop's K-9. 3 years earlier, Officer Thomas Calder stood under the harsh sun at a Northern Plains K-9 training center, clipboard in hand, watching his newly assigned German Shepherd. This one's special," the veteran trainer, a woman with silver hair tied back, told him as they observed Duke execute complex commands with uncanny precision. "Best instincts I've seen in 20 years. Morning light glinted off Duke's glossy coat as he held his focus, undeterred by deliberate noises ringing from the training yard's corners. When simulated gunfire erupted from hidden speakers, Duke didn't flinch. He advanced, taking down a padded assistant with textbook form. "His drive is exceptional," the trainer continued, eyes on Duke, "but what sets him apart is control. Most high-drive dogs can't dial it back. This one switches from combat to calm in an instant. To prove it, he signaled Duke to release. He let go of the assistant instantly, retreating to sit alertly. When a child-sized dummy entered the scenario, Duke's demeanor softened, shifting to guard beside it rather than treat it as a target. Officer Thomas Calder and Duke became legends in the regional force, racking up 10 successful takedowns and 18 drug busts in their first year. The German Shepherd could sniff out narcotics in the cleverest hiding spots, track suspects across rugged terrain, and neutralize threats with surgical accuracy. Their seamless partnership made them the department's most reliable asset in high-stakes missions. It's like they share a mind, a colleague remarked after watching them clear a derelict building without a single spoken command. The dockside raid changed everything, starting as routine. Intel indicated a major methamphetamine shipment was stashed there before distribution. What the intel missed was the presence of ex-military mercenaries armed with semi-automatic rifles, ready to fire without hesitation. As the tactical team breached the main entrance, they walked into a trap. Officer Liam Hayes, a rookie 3 weeks on the job, froze in the deadly crossfire. Without hesitation, Calder shoved Hayes to cover, taking a barrage of bullets himself. Duke lunged at the nearest gunman, dropping him as Calder fell. The dog shielded his handler amid the chaos, taking a bullet to his hind leg, growling at anyone who approached. Even the tactical medics arriving after the shooters were subdued. The K-9 unit commander had to order Duke off, but by then, Calder was beyond saving. In the days that followed, Duke wasn't himself. The dog who'd once executed orders with zeal turned unpredictable. During evaluations, he aced courses, but snapped warily when an assistant moved too fast. 3 handlers tried to bond with him. Duke rejected them all. The final straw came when he lunged at a tech entering the facility with a wrench, mistaking it for a weapon. Though no one was seriously hurt, the department couldn't risk a K-9 with unstable triggers. Duke was slated for euthanasia until John Miller stepped in after hearing of the dog's plight from a close colleague. As the memory faded, Duke's focus sharpened on the threat before him. The man facing Ella, Victor Slade, with his angular face and scarred hand, radiated the tension Duke was trained to spot in armed suspects. Though his police days were behind him, those instincts remained hardwired. Slade's hand edged toward his waist in a motion Duke knew too well from years facing armed foes. "Come here, kid," Slade ordered, his voice thick with menace, his fingers hovering near the hidden dagger. As Slade lunged toward Ella, Duke exploded into action with the precision that once made him the force's deadliest K-9 asset. His powerful jaws clamped onto Slade's wrist, applying just enough force to immobilize without maiming, a skill honed through countless training hours. Slade roared in pain and shock, dropping to his knees as Duke held firm. "Let me go, you bastard," he yelled, his free hand flailing uselessly against Duke's solid frame, unable to budge him. No gang-back Slade in this moment. Just him, alone, facing a dog who'd once been a criminal's nightmare. Ella trembled behind Duke, her senses overwhelmed but her mind sharp amid the panic. Through the haze of fear, she recalled her father's safety drills. With shaking hands, she grasped the emergency whistle around her neck and blew 2 short, piercing blasts, the danger signal John had drilled into her. The shrill sound echoed down the quiet street, startling Slade but not breaking his focus on wrestling Duke. Slade's composure cracked. He yanked the dagger from his waistband and aimed it at Duke. "Let go, or I'll slit your throat," he snarled at the shepherd. Duke didn't budge. He'd been trained to hold apprehension grips under threat, a skill Calder had reinforced through countless simulations. His eyes stayed locked on Slade, assessing the new danger without releasing the man's wrist. "I said let go," Slade gritted, the blade trembling in his grip. Ella had no one else to rely on but herself. With all the strength she could muster, she shouted, "Duke, hold!" A command she'd heard John use playfully with the dog near their home. Her voice quavered but carried enough clarity. Duke tightened his grip slightly, drawing a hiss of pain from Slade. The man swung the dagger at Duke, but the awkward motion was hampered by his pinned arm. "You want to die, you stupid mutt?" Slade bellowed, though his eyes wavered as he realized escape wouldn't come easily. The situation spiraled to its peak. Victor Slade, in a rage-fueled frenzy, fumbled with his free hand for a concealed pistol in his jacket pocket. At that moment, John burst from around the corner, catching the glint of steel aimed at Duke's back. "Duke, release!" he barked, drawing his service weapon. Duke let go of Slade's wrist and leapt aside, but not fast enough. The bullet grazed his hip, tearing a bloody gash through his black fur. The shepherd stumbled briefly, his hind legs shaking from the shock, giving Slade a chance to scramble up. "There's no way out, Slade," John said, leveling his gun at his old foe, his voice hard as steel. "On your knees now." Slade, eyes bloodshot and wrist dripping red, shifted the pistol to his good hand. "You won't shoot me, Miller. You're too soft." "Try me," John replied, his tone calm but chilling. "You threaten my family. There's nothing I won't do to protect them." For a moment the two men, one a protector, the other consumed by vengeance, locked eyes across the narrow street. Then Slade's gaze darted to Duke, who was steadying himself despite the blood trickling from his wound. "That damn dog should have been dead years ago," he growled, suddenly pivoting and lunging at Duke, pistol raised for a fatal shot. John fired once. The crack echoed through the quiet neighborhood as Slade crumpled mid-step, his gun clattering to the pavement. He lay still, blood pooling beneath him as John approached cautiously, weapon still trained on the fallen enemy. "Officer needs assistance. Suspect down," John reported into his radio, kicking Slade's pistol aside before checking his pulse. Finding none, he holstered his gun and turned to Duke. The German shepherd stood firm despite his injury, training holding him steady as blood stained his hind leg. Only when John knelt beside him did Duke let out a soft whimper, finally acknowledging the pain he'd suppressed. "Good boy," John whispered, his voice thick as he pressed on the wound. "The bravest boy. We need a vet now," he shouted toward the street where onlookers began to emerge. Within minutes, Lieutenant Harris's cruiser screeched into the street, the officer leaping out with his gun drawn, scanning the scene before realizing the threat was neutralized. "Command station," John called, still staunching Duke's wound. "Slade was targeting my family for revenge. He's been stalking us since his escape." Harris nodded grimly, barking orders into his radio for a perimeter check and additional units as more patrol cars arrived to secure the area. A nearby patrol team cordoned off the street, followed by a vet rushing forward with a first aid kit. "Everyone back, let me assess," she said briskly, examining Duke. "Deep graze wound from the bullet, but no major vessels hit. He needs surgery to remove fragments." After 3 grueling hours in surgery, Dr. Evans emerged from the operating room, his scrubs stained with dried blood, exhaustion etched into his face. The Miller family rose as one, tension crackling as they searched his expression for clues. "The surgery was tougher than expected," Dr. Evans began, pulling off his mask. "The bullet caused significant damage, tore through thigh muscle, nicked a small vein, and left a hairline crack in the pelvis." John's heart sank. "But he's alive?" "Yes," Dr. Evans confirmed, "though he's critical. We've stitched the wound and transfused 3 units of blood. The muscle damage was complex, over 80 sutures to reattach the tissue. The next 12 hours are decisive." "Can we see him?" Ella asked, her voice small but steady. Dr. Evans hesitated, glancing at Sarah for guidance. "He's heavily sedated with monitoring gear. It might be upsetting." "Please," Ella cut in, rare for a girl who usually shied from confrontation. "He needs to know we're here." After a moment, Dr. Evans nodded. "He's in recovery." The recovery ward glowed softly, quiet save for the steady beeps of machines. Duke lay on a padded bed, his once powerful form fragile beneath a thin blanket. A breathing tube jutted from his nose, IV lines delivering fluids, antibiotics, and painkillers. His injured leg was bandaged and propped on a support. Ella approached slowly, her usual sensory aversions forgotten as she focused solely on Duke. She placed her small hand gently on his forehead, avoiding the IV in his foreleg. "I'm here," she said, her clear voice ringing in the stillness. "You did it, Duke. You saved me. Now you have to get strong." The monitors beeped on, but Duke lay still, the mighty canine reduced to a frail creature battling for life. Dr. Evans adjusted the IV drip, checking the screens. "His vitals are stable for now," he said quietly, "but he's not out of the woods. The next few hours are critical." "What are his odds?" John asked, the question gnawing at him since they'd arrived. Dr. Evans paused, his gaze softening with empathy. "If he makes it through the next 12 hours, his chances rise significantly. He's young and was healthy before this. But I'll be honest, the damage is severe." Even if he recovers, he may never walk normally again. The words hung heavy, laden with harsh implications. A K9, even retired, without full mobility, lost a core piece of its identity. You mean he might be? Ella faltered, her sharp mind seeking the right term despite her churning emotions. Disabled, Dr. Evans supplied gently. Yes, it's possible. The pelvis will heal, but the muscle damage could mean lasting weakness or limited motion. Ella nodded, absorbing this with her characteristic clarity. That's okay, she said after a beat, her voice soft but certain. He doesn't need to chase bad guys anymore. He just needs to be Duke. The simplicity and sincerity in her words brought tears to John's eyes. He laid his hand atop Ella's on Duke's head, feeling the familiar warmth of the shepherd's fur. Dr. Evans is right, Ella, Sarah added, her medical background urging her to prepare her daughter for tough realities. Even if Duke survives, recovery will be long and hard. He might not be the same dog you know. He'll always be Duke, Ella replied, her conviction unshakable. Like I'm always Ella, even when my brain works differently. As night deepened, Duke's condition worsened. His temperature spiked despite cooling efforts, and his blood pressure plummeted. Dr. Evans administered more meds, his face tightening as he tracked Duke's responses. He's developing complications, he told John and Sarah while Ella dozed fitfully on a waiting room couch. The deep wounds triggering an inflammatory response. His body's attacking itself. Can we do more? John asked, desperation edging his voice. We're doing all we can medically, Dr. Evans replied, his eyes heavy. It's up to Duke now. At 2:30 a.m., the crisis peaked. Duke's heart rate erratic, the monitor flashing unstable waves as his oxygen levels crashed. The vet team sprang into action, injecting emergency drugs while Dr. Evans began chest compressions. He's septic, an assistant reported, boosting oxygen flow. Ella jolted awake amid the noise, alert despite her exhaustion. Before John or Sarah could stop her, she darted to the treatment room door, wide-eyed as the team fought to stabilize Duke. Don't go, she whispered, her hands pressed to the glass. Please stay with us, Duke. For 4 agonizing minutes, Dr. Evans and his team battled to pull Duke back. The drugs took hold, and the monitor's chaotic beeps steadied into a rhythm. Dr. Evans stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow as he checked the readings. He's through, he said, relief tinged with caution. Vitals are stabilizing. Ella stayed at the glass, hands pressed as if willing her strength through the barrier. John and Sarah stood behind her, drained from the ordeal, caught between hope and dread. In the recovery room, as if sensing the truths unfolding about his past, Duke stirred faintly. His eyes cracked open, focusing hazily on Ella, steadfast by his side. The monitors registered a subtle uptick in his vitals, slight but undeniable. He's responding, Dr. Evans said with guarded optimism, checking the data. He's improving. Sarah called John, who rushed in with Lieutenant Harris trailing. As they entered, Duke's eyes fully opened, recognizing John. His tail twitched faintly under the blanket, a weak but unmistakable sign. He's staying with us, Ella said with absolute certainty, stroking Duke's forehead gently. He knows we need him. 3 weeks after the clash with Victor Slade, Willow Creek began reclaiming its calm. The police department, post-Slade, ramped up patrols and overhauled protocols under Lieutenant Harris's stern leadership. Slade, the terror who'd haunted the town, was neutralized, and investigations found no accomplices, closing his chapter of vengeance. The mayor, moved by the Millers' bravery, launched a community fund for special needs kids and struggling families, pooling local budgets and his own donations. After 3 weeks of treatment, Duke was taken home by John's family. At the Miller home, the living room corner had become Duke's recovery hub. A specialized cushioned bed, donated by a local charity, sat by a wide window, letting the convalescing shepherd watch the front door and backyard through clear glass. Medical supplies, antibiotics, pain meds, fresh bandages, lined a nearby shelf for daily care. The investigation into Slade had cleared John fully, exposing the fugitive's personal vendetta against his family documented in police records. How's our patient today? John asked, setting his keys down and kneeling by Duke's bed. The German shepherd lifted his head instantly, tail thumping steadily, growing stronger daily. Though still needing help to stand, Duke's eyes gleamed with the alertness that once made him an elite K9, tracking the house's every move. "He ate all his breakfast today," Sarah reported, emerging from the kitchen with a cool glass. "Doctor," Evans called, "latest tests show infection markers are normal and the muscles regenerating well." That night, John woke to soft footsteps in the hall. Rising quietly, he found Ella's bed empty. Parental panic dissolved when he saw her curled on the rug beside Duke's bed, her small form rising and falling in deep, peaceful breaths. The shepherd lay awake, his bright eyes meeting John's in the dimness. A wordless pact between two guardians sharing the same duty. Instead of waking her, John fetched a blanket, draping it gently over his sleeping daughter. Duke acknowledged it with a faint tail wag, his gaze conveying what words couldn't. "I'll always watch over her." Back in bed, John reflected on the strange path that brought a broken K9 into their lives, and the profound ways Duke had reshaped their family. What began as an act of mercy, saving a creature from death's edge, had become their salvation through trials none foresaw. In their home's quiet, now whole again, after facing danger and near loss, John grasped a simple, piercing truth. Sometimes the greatest courage comes cloaked in fur. Walking on four legs, offering protection without condition and loyalty without limit. Between this girl and her dog lay a bond no darkness could sever, no tragedy could dim. A living testament to the enduring power of trust, freely given and fiercely kept. In life's twilight, we seek moments that affirm our deepest truths. Duke and Ella's story reminds us that courage takes many forms, sometimes shining in the steadfast eyes of a four-legged guardian, standing between peril and what we hold dear. Like Duke, many of us bear unseen scars from past battles, yet find purpose in shielding what matters most. This bond between child and shepherd mirrors the ties that sustain us through our darkest hours, connections needing no words to reveal their depth and strength. Reflecting on our own past, we see true heroism, not in flawless might, but in the unyielding resolve to protect despite our wounds and limits. May we all find a spark of Duke's loyalty in our bonds, and a trace of Ella's pure acceptance in how we view ourselves and others. For in the end, it's not the absence of scars that defines us, but the love we choose to give when we stand, however imperfectly, to guard what we cherish. Hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more tales like this. Drop a like and comment below with your thoughts. See you in the next video.